I wanted to start by thanking Shaoni, but she's in the hallway. Shaoni? All right. Well, I'll do that. Well, or I don't know. Anyway, I wanted to thank her because, for me, at least, speaking personally, this has been an extraordinarily generative day. Really wonderful performances and presentations, and I feel fortunate to have been here today. I also want to thank her for organizing this conference because I think the term vernacular and the ways of thinking that have come out of that today have been extremely interesting, generative, and important. I mean, we've all been talking all day about these dichotomies that we've been saddled with for years, right? The Margi, the Deshi, the folk, the classical, the urban, the rural. Dance theater even is one that we haven't actually mentioned, but I think we've all been working with all day long. Artist craftsperson is another one, that when somebody's dubbed a craftsperson, they're no longer thought of as an artist, right? And vice versa, et cetera. Although I have to say, I'm glad we haven't broken down the stereotype of the fact that all weddings in India are Punjabi weddings. So that's very important, I think, to maintain that stereotype. Okay. I think I'm particularly happy about this panel called Politicizing Folk, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives, because one of the dichotomies that this panel is going to address are the ways in which street theater, for example, is always thought of as being political theater, but it isn't talked about in terms of its theatricality or its style or its aesthetics. That somehow always falls out of the conversation. And similarly, when you're talking about something that has been categorized as a traditional performance or something like that, which we all know is always already contemporary, right? But there's a way in which those performances get spoken about as if they're not political or they're not dealing with current political issues. And so in this panel, we'll see that dichotomy break down, I think, in a quite a wonderful way. Our first speaker is Sudhanva Deshpande from Jananatya Manch. You might also know Jananatya Manch as Janam. He's an actor, director, and organizer with Janam, and he's directed 2 films about Habib Tanvir and Tanvir's company, Naya Theatre. And he's the editor of Our Stage, Pleasures and Perils of Theatre Practice in India, and Theatre of the Streets, the Jananatya Manch Experience. And his presentation has a different title than the one that's in your program. It's called The Unempty Space, with reference to Peter Brook. And it focuses on Janam's work with street theater, and particularly on an aspect of street theater that's not usually given much importance or attention, which is the fact that the spaces we perform in are never empty. And in fact, just to call attention to the fact that this space is not empty. We come to Barnard, that has a certain weight and history, and we bring a certain set of expectations to performances and panels that we see and hear in a place called Barnard College, right? So Sudhanva is going to talk a bit about all of those expectations, preconceptions, et cetera, and what that does.
Well, thanks, Erin. Thanks also for stealing my opening. No, just kidding. I'm very pleased to be here, partly because I don't really normally get to speak in academic kind of settings. I'm not very used to this, and so on. But I will run you through 15 images. And through these 15 images, I hope to talk about this idea of space. The group that I belong to is called Jananatya Manch. That has become kind of the logo of the group. It wasn't meant to be. We had asked a designer friend, Arijit Sen, to design a T-shirt for us. And he said, what should the T-shirt have? We said, well, why don't we use the slogan of the IPTA from the 1940s, People's Theatre Stars the People, which we've kind of taken over because we see ourselves as being very much part of the IPTA tradition. We see ourselves as being the inheritors of that legacy. We are not the only ones. There are hundreds of other groups across the country who are part of that tradition. And we said to Aujee that, well, maybe that's a slogan that we could work with. So he designed this lovely image which has people, and it has a circle, which is street theater, and it has a star in the middle, right? So people's theater stars the people. The defining feature of street theater that you can't help but not just be struck by, it's there in your face, it hits you the moment you see any performance of street theater, is that it's so intimate, that the audience is right there. They're not even within spitting distance. There's sometimes, you're actually afraid as an actor to step on toes, literally, you know. Once I had this wonderful experience of saying these lines which were, you know, very charged, very politically charged, and I sang those lines with great focus, while at my feet a little kid of maybe 3.5, with equal focus, was untying my shoelaces. So that's the kind of intimacy we have with our audiences. But the thing is, what do audiences do? I come from the city of Delhi. Delhi in India is thought of as being the center of political power. It's the administrative sort of headquarters of the country in a sense. It's a city of the rich and the powerful. It didn't used to be much of an economic sort of force that was Bombay, but increasingly it has become that, especially now with, you know, Gurgaon, Noida, etc., all of that. It's become one of the largest urban agglomerations in the world. Depending on how you define Delhi, the population of Delhi is anything between 15 million to about 26, 27 million people. At 15 million already, you are larger than the Netherlands. Yeah. And that's just the sort of municipal limits of Delhi. But if you think of the city as NCR, the National Capital Region, then it's huge. On the one side, you have Faridabad, you have Gurgaon, you have Noida. You know, it spreads into 3 states. It's massive. You could drive through Delhi from one end to the other without actually ever getting the feeling that you're exiting the city, right? You would feel that you're in one continuous urban space for about 100 kilometers, literally. And I say this with great authority because I've done that. Very often when we go to perform, we go to really far-flung areas. It takes us hours to get there, right? It's a huge city. But it's also, just as it is the city of the powerful, I sometimes think that a more useful metaphor to think of Delhi is to really think of little islands of power that are within a vast sea of the powerless. Little islands of great affluence in a huge morass, in the quicksand of huge poverty. That's really how I see the city often. I see the city as being a sort of a, it's easy to get from, let's say, the Indira Gandhi International Airport to the Formula One race circuit, which is an obscenity that's been built outside Delhi. And you know, you could drive through the whole way on a very fancy sort of a really nice road, right? 6-lane, this, that, all the rest of it, and so on. And you could actually come away thinking that that's India. But I was very pleased to see that the first time that the F1 race happened in India, this was about 3 years ago, Lewis Hamilton, who's one of the richest sports person in the world, he actually, in the press conference, he said, you know what's really shocking about India is that the inequality hits you in the face. And I said to myself, oh my God, This is Lewis Hamilton saying this. He must have landed at the international airport and driven in a very fancy car on very fancy roads, and he still says that the inequality hits you in the face. What about the rest of the city? The rest of the city is pretty much like this. This is an image from a locality known as Kusumpur Pahadi. Those of you who might know Delhi, it's right next door to Vasant Vihar. On the one side, Vasant Kunj on the other side, and JNU on the third side. It supplies a lot of the labor to all of these three fairly upper middle class sort of enclaves, right? But it's hidden from view. You could actually go past it several times without actually even realizing that it's there. Why? Because it's literally on a pahadi, on a small hillock. One of the most important things that happens here every evening is that water arrives. That's a very critical part of the life of this locality, because nobody gets pipe water coming home, right? And so therefore, at that time, at about 4 to 5 in the evening, to fill water is critical. It's in that kind of a context that the actors reach the locality, and we start negotiating the small streets to go towards the performance. Obviously, we become sort of Pied Pipers, so we have a whole lot of kids behind us who start following us. We are known by our black kurtas, so they know that we are actors. They know that we often come to perform. This would be true of Kusumpur Pahadi. It would also be true of several other places, but obviously not the whole of Delhi. Delhi is huge. So in several parts, they might not know us, but in some parts, they do know us. And they start following us. And what's important for the actors to realize is that we might think of ourselves as being artists, and we might think of ourselves as performing an important task of bringing something of value to the community that we go out to perform in. But it's really important to know at all times that it's not the most important thing that happens in the community. That there will always be other things that are more important than your play. In this case, for instance, the filling of water will always be more important than any performance, any art that goes there. This is the lifeline of this locality. Now, what you don't want to do, therefore, when you go there with a street play, is that, of course, theoretically, the street play can happen anywhere. And it does pretty much happen at several different kinds of locations. But it's important to bear in mind the fact that when you go out and perform, you should not disrupt that which is more important than what you are bringing there, right? So your art is important. It's important to you. And it might eventually become important to your spectators and to the local community. But that's not the assumption with which you must start. You must start with the assumption that there is always something else that is more important. And is that something else, something that you are able to relate with or not? The unempty space. The cliche, of course, from Peter Brook's time has been that all you need is an empty space. You need one actor to walk across it, one spectator to see this walking across, and that's enough for an act of theater to take place. And of course, that's true in a sense. What is not true is that there is a notion of an empty space. No space is empty, ever. Spaces are full of history. Spaces are full of contestations, and you have to relate to that. In India, of course, in a city like Delhi or Bombay or any of our large cities, spaces are not empty in many ways. Sometimes they are not empty simply because there are so many people around. or animals. Sometimes, you choose a space where you're going to be performing, and that's a space that other beings think of as their own space. And so therefore, if you're a smart actor, you're able to incorporate that fact into your performance, as this young actor is doing. Well, the goat obviously thinks that the space belongs to her, and she looks upon the actor as a sort of a trespasser, and the actor, to her credit, is able to incorporate that into the performance. But that's the nature of space. Especially when you're doing street theater, you have to go with the assumption that spaces are never empty. Now, one way in which spaces are not empty is, of course, this. That spaces are full of people, spaces are full of children especially, spaces are full of animals, they're full of economic activity, they're full of other kinds of activity. That is the life of the entire community, right? And it's in that space that you're going. It's in that space that you're going and inserting something that is actually speaking foreign to that community. It is not internal to the community, actually, right? The idea, of course, is at the end of the whole performance, your audiences should feel that they want you back, right? Even though it's a disruption in their daily lives, it should become a welcome disruption. This morning when we were watching the films, especially the film on Bidesi and in Bombay, I kept thinking to myself, and it's a feeling I've had when I've actually seen these performances as well, that when large numbers of working class people watch these performances, actually, it's all very well for us to have a sociological view of it, have a performance sort of a perspective towards it, etc., to be fascinated by it. And of course, one should be it is fascinating. There's no question about it, right? When 50,000 people turn up to watch a form of song and dance in their own language, in a sort of a foreign land, it is fascinating. But it's also highly degrading, frankly. The form of what is being done and the content of what is being done is not something that is elevating in any way. It might relieve the monotony and the oppression of your life, but actually what are you doing in that hyper masculine, almost misogynist kind of a space, right? It's not elevating. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that this is what capitalism does. It degrades you, especially if you're a working class person, it degrades you. And the only forms of so-called entertainment that are then available to you are these forms which are frankly not forms that I would ever celebrate. I'm fascinated by them. Academically, politically, sociologically, anthropologically, etc. I'm fascinated by what happens, but I don't celebrate them. It's important, therefore, to go. It's important, therefore, to also understand that spaces are not empty in that sense. That the form that you're taking to them, the theater that you're taking to them, the stories that you're taking to them, also have other stories that are in competition with the stories that you are telling, right? There are other forms also, other cultural forms that are in, not in competition, but in contradiction. There's contestation, right? It's not one big happy family of artistic forms. No, it really isn't. And so therefore, what you want is to be able to take theater that is politically engaged, that makes people think, that brings people together in a different kind of collectivity than what, for instance, this morning we saw in Bidesia. I would hate it if my male working class audiences were to be shooting a performance with their phone and focusing only on the women. I would hate it, frankly. It is actually what that phone is doing is directing an extremely misogynist gaze at the performer. And that's not something that I would valorize simply because there are 50,000 people there. I'll just run through some of the slides because I'm running out of time. Spaces are also not empty in this sense. Now, these little blue statues are something that all of us who are familiar with India know exactly what this is, right? This is Ambedkar. Now, the fact that you're performing under the statue of Ambedkar means that this space is not empty. It means that this is a Dalit basti where you're performing. It means that the fact of the statue, whether it has been set up by the municipal authority or the government, or whether it has been set up by the community, it means that there is Dalit assertion. And the fact that you choose to perform under that statue and bring people together there brings into the performance space a different kind of collectivity. It brings into the performance space a different sort of community that is now being forged. It's a different kind of solidarity that now begins to be forged. And it really doesn't matter at the end of the day what the content of your play then is. I'm not making a plea for shoddy content. I'm not at all making a plea for that. I am saying that, of course, as street theater people, we have a responsibility towards our audiences to bring the very best theater that we can make, right? But whatever play I do under that statue is framed by that statue and is framed by the entire history of contestation that runs for about 5,000 years that is embodied in that statue. Or a picture like this, which seems like a fairly, everyday, innocuous kind of a picture. What do you see here? You see factory workers who are watching the play. You see a main road on one side where there are buses, and where the camera is, there's actually a railway line, and across the railway line are factories. Now, what's happening here is that it's a short play of about 12 minutes. It's called Machine, and the play is being performed 6 times one after the other, right? As the audiences are coming and going, one shift is getting off from work, and the next shift is coming into work. You catch them there, and you show them a short piece, a 12-minute piece, and that's your play. But this is a picture from the mid-90s. It's from around 95. No longer will you have this kind of a situation. Why? Because capitalists are smart people. They figure that if a shift is let off and a shift goes in at exactly the same time, it becomes a potent moment for solidarities to be formed. So therefore, now today what you have? You have a sliding scale. Every half an hour, every 45 minutes, every 1 hour, a few workers would be let off and a few workers would go in, right? But the factory keeps working all the time. This picture, I unfortunately can't show you the context of this picture, but you'll have to take my word for it. This is a picture outside a factory called Bhushan Steel in Ghaziabad. Now what this factory does is, it basically gets a lot of scrap metal from across the world, and it smelts it, and then steel is then produced. It's got these giant smelters and boilers and so on, huge things that go up about 4 or 5 stories and so on. 10,000 workers work here. As I said, it gets scrap from across the world. One of the places where scrap is produced on the daily basis is a war zone, obviously. So it gets a lot of scrap from Afghanistan, from Iraq, and so on. On 2 occasions that have been actually documented, but the workers say that there are more than 2 occasions when this happened. But on 2 occasions, as they were shifting the scrap from the truck, loading, unloading, etc., one of the empty artillery shells, which was supposed to have been a spent shell, but it obviously wasn't, it went off, right? And it killed some people, we don't know exactly how many. A few years later, when we had gone into the area to do interviews with workers, we heard this story, and that story came into our play, and that's the play that is being performed right now, where a worker is sitting next to the body, next to the corpse of a worker who has died in this. And when the trade unionist goes up to that worker and he says, well, you're crying next to this body, whose body is this? This worker stops crying. And he says, no, I don't know, etc. So his friend comes up to him and says, well, tell these guys, these are good guys, these are union guys, they'll help you. Whose body is that? So he breaks down crying and he says, this is my brother's body. Now, why does a brother not acknowledge his sibling's body? Simply because he is too scared that if he acknowledges, he will lose his job. Now, these are the stories that come into our plays. And the moment you do this play at Bhushan Steel, right? And not just at Bhushan Steel, in the entire locality, anywhere if you go, these are stories that are well known. Spaces are not empty. This is a performance from, I think, the year 2000. It's in the middle of a large slum. Now, today, if you go there, there's no slum. There's a park. And the park came up there overnight because, well, the city wanted to beautify itself, right? And so the entire slum, literally overnight, it was amazing. 1 week we did the performance where this picture was taken. The next week I was driving past and I said, oh, hey, hang on, where's the slum? And it wasn't there. The entire place, I swear to you, had turned into a park with full-grown trees. It was like magical. It was like out of a movie. I said, just last week we were here, right? Spaces are not empty, but spaces can be made empty. This is my last image. This is from you could call it a performance, you could call it a happening, you could call it what you want. On the 16th of December, and year and a half ago, there was a gang rape in Delhi. It caught international attention. Lots of protests happened, etc., etc. Eventually, the victim, the young woman, she died, and so on. She was given, several names, Nirbhaya, etc., whatever. And so a bunch of us came together and we said, okay, so what can we do in response to this? Of course, we can do plays, all that, but what more can we do? And one of the questions that we sort of focused on was to say, okay, the reason why this rape took place in the first place is because at 9:30 at night, when she and her friend were standing on the road to catch a bus, there was no bus. There was no public transport bus at that time. And so they waited and waited and waited. When no bus arrived, then they finally had to take a private bus. And that's where she was raped. So we said, okay, so how about we go to the bus stop and catch the 9:30 bus back home. And let's make it a public event. Let's call as many people as we can. And so therefore, at a fairly busy sort of bus station where several buses come, we all landed up there at about 9:15 or so at night. And we said, okay, we are going to take the last bus home. And so whoever lived in whatever area, we just went home from there by buses. And we said, okay, we are performers, we are actors, we are artists, and so on. We are writers and stuff. So when we go back home, we are going to sort of populate the bus or infuse the bus with our art So lots of people came with their own little things. Some people read poetry, some people sang songs, some people, did little acts, and so on. And throughout the journey, all the people in their own different ways, because this wasn't quite planned in that sense. There was a broad framework, but nobody really had been told, you do this, you do that, whatever. But the idea was really that we must speak to people on the bus, on the way back home, right? Speak to as many people as we can. This is something that got repeated a few times after that. And I brought this slide into this presentation to say that even something as innocuous as taking a bus back home, even that spot, even that space, the bus stop, is not an empty space. And as performers, as people who are politically engaged, as people who care deeply about the fate of our country, the fate of our city, the fate of the working people, the poor, women, and Dalits, and so on and so forth, it's important for us all the time to engage with all of these histories, with all of these different contestations, with all of these contradictions, and then to think of how we are going to be disruptive of the status quo, but disruptive in hopefully a nice and fun and entertaining and intelligent and elevating kind of manner. And through that, to try and forge collectivities, to try and forge solidarities that are not based on conservative values, but try and forge solidarities that are based on progressive values. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Dipti Khera. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Art History and the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU. And her interests lie in the intersection of art and urban topography in paintings, maps, architecture, and literature. And she's currently writing a book and developing an exhibit that reveals the major shift in Indian art represented by Udaipur painters' engagement with conceptualizing place and representing reality during a time of intense political and artistic transition in the 18th and 19th centuries. So you'll begin to see, I think, right away some of the overlapping kind of thoughts and ideas. Her paper is titled Painting, Writing, and Singing Praises of Cities, Vernacular Meditations in 18th and 19th Century Rajasthan. And it deals with the idea of praising places that are proposed by Udaipur's artists. I won't say any more than that. I'm scared now of giving things away. But we'll just... I don't know with a PowerPoint where to begin. Okay, great.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Erin. Thank you, Shayoni, for including me in this conference. Huh. What happened? It's there. Okay. For inviting me to this conference. Thank you to the audience, because you'll have to deal with a shift in material, shift in time period with what I present here today. But Shayoni was convinced that we can talk about vernacular mediations across time periods, across media. And so I'm going with her conviction, and hopefully, we'll have some interesting ideas to talk about. Okay. So 18th and 19th century artists hailing from Udaipur were consumed by making pictures of their place. They pictured the rulers of Udaipur court within spectacular settings of the lakes and lake palaces and the architectural and urban environs of the city. In this painting that you see of the Jagmandir Lake Palace, a group of unnamed court artists composed the palace as a self-contained floating world in the lake. As you can see, the artist, perhaps can we get the lights a little? That's a... I can't read them. I should know I've taught in this room, but I don't remember. Okay, yeah, that's enough. Yeah. So as you can see over here, we actually have the King Ari Singh depicted 6 times. I don't know if you can see clearly, but he's shooting fish over here. He's processing with his ladies at various instances, enjoying various parts of the palace, the gardens, and so on. So this is a picture of the lake palace within which a specific ruler is shown immersed in activities belonging to the realm of pleasure, not politics in a direct way. But it's a painting that seeks to praise one of the key attributes of idealized kingship, that the ideal king was a consummate lover and a seeker of all the pleasures, arts, and beauty that his kingdom offered. Early 18th century artists in the Udaipur court atelier shifted their attention from making smaller genealogical portraits and poetic manuscripts to large-scale paintings that were about 3 to 5 feet in length, which portrayed the rulers enacting their authority within spectacular architectural and urban and landscape settings. Udaipur, a city that some of you might be aware with, is a city of lime-washed white palaces overlooking the lakes, and it's a place that evokes the imaginary of an oasis within northwestern India, within its dry and desert landscape. And Udaipur's early 18th century artists were the first ones to draw on their experience of admiring the visuality of their cities. So now, since I've given you this very abbreviated picture of what's happening at the court, let us step outside the court. So outside the court, several poets like Khetal composed poems such as the Udaipuri Ghazal, first written in 1718 for praising cities. This poem was widely circulated until the end of the 19th century by means of both manuscript copies and sung performances in the streets, bazaars, and pilgrimage trails of the region. Khetal composed his verses in mixed regional languages and praised Udaipur by adapting a set of panegyric idioms from circulating Indo-Persianate poetry. He embeds the idea of seeing the city from various geographical and subjective positions, that is, as he himself views its locales through the eyes of the rulers, other travelers, and citizens of Udaipur. He also presents several vignettes describing the diversity and beauty of Udaipur's people, markets, crafts, luxury goods, religious domains, several bazaars. The colophons of several manuscripts, like one of them says, "Ye ghazal gai bhi khoob, likhi bhi khoob," attest that the poem really celebrated the city's imaginary and crafted its memory for broader audiences in and beyond Udaipur. This milieu of praising Udaipur, forged by the city's artists and poets, within practices that focused on not just the courtly space in the ruler, but the city itself, especially as it emerges from the space of the market and religious travels, is the focus of my talk today. And I will draw from my wide-ranging corpus of praise pictures a single painted invitation letter in which artists and scribes depict Udaipur as a charismatic landscape par excellence. So in 1830, the regional merchants and the ruler of Udaipur jointly sent a painted paper scroll 72 feet long and 11 inches wide, an invitation letter, a Vignapti Patra, to the eminent pontiff of the Jain religious community, Sri Jinna Harsha Suri. The merchants and Udaipur ruler requested that he spend the next monsoon season in their vibrant city. Along the length of the scroll, in the first 65 feet, an unnamed artist pictured a principal street of Udaipur, painting and labeling the important palaces, temples, and bazaars. He further painted an elaborate procession comprising the Udaipur ruler Jawan Singh, as well as the British colonial agent Alexander Cobb, which, as you see here, creates this unique dual axis within the scroll. So you'll be tilting your necks a lot. The scribes, in the last 6 to 7 feet of the invitation letter, Pandits Rukhabdas Das and Khushal Chand wrote this entire invitation letter. In the last 3 feet of the scroll, as you see in the image on the right, there are signatures of more than 25 prominent merchants of the city. Khetal's city poem on Udaipur was in circulation for more than 100 years before this 1830 Udaipur scroll was made. Khetal, in fact, identified himself as belonging to a particular community of Jain monks, the Khartharagacha, who traveled with pontiffs and maintained manuscript libraries attached with Jain temples. Khetal's couplets, which set up mirrored parallel lenses from the vantage points of the royal procession, merchants, itinerant monks, and lay people, perhaps inflected the artist's imaginary or the viewer's perception of how to interpret the scroll. So the 1830 Udaipur painted invitation letter provides a rare vantage point from the religious, mercantile networks and bazaar spaces that operated at the nexus of regional and metropolitan polities to consider the development of a vernacular perspective on issues like observing, documenting, and idealizing a place. It's only in recent years that scholars of South Asia have been critically reconceptualizing the 18th century by exploring questions of popular histories. Raizuddin Akil and Partho Chatterjee highlight the need to draw a distinction between the emergence of the early modern and the colonial model, especially in the early period of the British rule, to consider the epistemic possibilities of the vernacular, not something teleologically predetermined by the ascendancy of a dominant European definition, whether of art, whether of history, or modernity. A Vignapti Patra was made in order to circulate and to encourage and facilitate travels by circulating the urban imaginary of a city as a thriving place, politically, culturally, artistically, religiously, and economically. The 1830 Udaipur scroll exemplifies one of the most extensive artistic engagement with this genre. The artists particularly deployed detail and repetition to show the extent of Udaipur as a flourishing city. The scroll embodies the aesthetics of praise that are distinct from simple reportage. So the question that became important for me is that why is it important to think what kind of work the analytic of praise and placemaking, the intersection between them, performs specifically in the 18th-19th century world of South Asia? On the broadest level, 1830 evokes a time when the British East India Company was establishing its apparatus of colonial rule across the Indian subcontinent. A dominant perspective offered in the contemporaneous British accounts characterized the history of the long 18th century following the decentralization of the Mughal Empire in the early 18th century and prior to the establishment of the British Empire in the mid-18th century as one of political and cultural decline. Especially the aesthetic of ruination circulated through the picturesque sketches and watercolors made by British artists has mediated the art of place in 18th century South Asia as one deeply inflected by narratives of decline. So here you see a picturesque sketch of Udaipur with this overgrown, ruinous kind of landscape made by Patrick Waugh, one of the artist assistants of James Todd. It's not surprising that Todd, who was the first British colonial agent, based in Udaipur city, interpreted Udaipur's lake palaces as markers of the voluptuous inactivity and decline of the power of Indian princes. So broadly speaking, the art made by Indian artists of this period, courtly or outside the court, has often been characterized as a corollary to political decline. The idea of praising places proposed by Udaipur's artists and poets in the 18th and 19th century is therefore critical for reconceiving this time and place. Praise may be the counterpoint to decadence. Scholars have noted that the evocation of a place as a charismatic landscape emerged as a distinct practice within South Asia's early modern vernacular literary cultures. The visual practices of praising the city seen in this 1830 scroll in Sumati Ramaswamy's words allow us to think about the formation of territory through an analytic of affect. Others have highlighted that the language and affect of praise allows for forging deep sentimental bonds between a community and its object of devotion. While praise is a descriptive act whose contours can be fairly standard, the performance and interpretation of praise may point us to new and subjective spaces which are in dialogue with specific cultural and historical contexts. So let us then turn to this Vignapti Patra to see how the artist employs this economy of praise as an affective strategy, not just to create a parallel vision, this is 1830, to say Patrick was sketch that I just showed, but really an alternate imaginary is what I find here that counters and confronts Todd's project very directly. So in these slides, for example, you can see Jawan Singh, who is then the ruler of Udaipur. Here he's seen processing, in the lake with his entourage around the lake palaces. He's dining in the kitchen area and the dining court that is there in the palaces. He's over here performing rituals at the temple in the court. He's over here sitting in the Baradari Khana and presiding over his nobles. So, the artist has really taken these vignettes from court painting and arranged them within this vertical space of the scroll. And in doing so, he's really kind of, trying to praise Udaipur, I think, as an ideal place, as an ideal court, borrowing from court painting. What the artist also does in a very clever way is that while the court paintings emphasize this kind of horizontal unity of a palace facade, which is rather elusive, he really distributes this entire facade along the vertical axis, right? The kind of the material format that he's working with. But it's not just a certain kind of splitting up of the facade which is taking place without any thinking. He's really thinking about the spaces he's depicting. So for example, over here, you're seeing a courtyard inserted in a plan format between the elevations of the two individual palaces that are there on its either side, right? Which you can't really see within just looking at this palace facade over here. So it's a very clever adaptation of courtly conventions, if you will. In addition to the palaces, the artist has rendered elevations of temple spires and which reference the presiding deity, thereby picturing a plethora of religious precincts. He's also labeled the domains, such as Hanuman Mandir, Saji Fakir Ka Takhiya, Dadu Pantiri Jaga, all of which suggests the artist's interest in mapping a wide variety of religious spaces, from Hindu temples of multiple deities to shrines of Sufi saints, mosques, and also Jain temples, but not just Jain temples, right? The artist chose to depict some precincts by combining plan and elevation views, a convention that was really adopted with particular zest by Udaipur court artists. By this means, for example, in the Sitla Mata temple, perhaps he's referring to the importance of this temple space and its in everyday life. In depicting, for example, the women's palace, which was not depicted in several of the court paintings. You can see that he's showing this courtyard in the center, surrounded by these smaller pavilions that are there around it, and he's really referencing a contemporaneous plan of the palaces of Udaipur. He's someone who is, and then he's labeled all of these spaces very, very specifically. So this attests, in my opinion, to his expertise in mapping Udaipur and in claiming the Vignapti Patra, a painted travel invitation, as an epistemic genre suitable for expressing his cartographic vision. In visualizing the urban ethnography, the artist also sought to expand the picturing of mercantile space. We see that he's depicted multiple shops of each type of tradesman or craftsman, from dyers to arm makers, utensil sellers, cloth sellers, flower sellers, money lenders, all of them are there. And the artist evokes spatial clusters within the bazaar. He highlights the acts of making and selling and delineates each individual's turban and facial features. This personalization, visible even in the smallest detail of men's beards, perhaps suggests some kind of connections between specific communities and the trades they practice. Indeed, all Vignapti Patras included vignettes of shops composed on either side of a central street. Some examples also showed the scroll, which was dated, being handed over to a messenger by a merchant, thus showing it's really that it belonged to the space of the bazaar. But our Udaipur artist in this case, by really expanding the space of the bazaar, giving us the sense of neighborhoods, really goes beyond this idea of the metaphorical space of the bazaar, where he's really claiming it as a space in which this performance is taking place. So then what he does next is that he juxtaposes on the central street, he paints an extensive formal procession that traverses the horizontal axis of the scroll. He's depicted a long retinue of footmen, horses, and troops, culminating in the portrayal of the ruler Jawan Singh mounted on an elephant. Further down the street, we see Udaipur's current political agent, Alexander Cobb, accompanied by sepoys and Skinner's cavalry from the British Indian Army. The artist drew upon the symbolic currency of the aesthetic trope of processions that Udaipur artists employed in this time period to construct royal portraits and commemorate practiced processions. The scrolls artist, in turn, composed the horizontally painted processions within the vertical idiom of the Vignapti Patra, creating a perplexing dual axis along which one must view it. The juxtaposition of conventions situates the procession within the bazaars of Udaipur, within the space within which the procession was performed and upon which it really relied, rather than presenting Udaipur's palaces as a panegyrical backdrop for rulers or for merchants. Equally important as the representation of the city is the artist's imagery of Udaipur's environs beyond the courtly domains and city walls. The artist has pictured the British residency of Captain Alexander Cobb, labeled as the Sahib's bungalow and cantonment of the Firangi. As you can see, he's carefully depicted the lawns that are there in the space. You can see that they are seated on chairs. So he's really pointing to the difference in lifestyle. Yet it is important to note that Udaipur's suburban frontiers were not solely dominated by the British presence. On the other side of the central street, in the most striking way, the artist has pictured and labeled the assembly to be held by the invited Jain pontiff, Jinna Harsha Suri, who's expected to come next year. He visualizes the Jain pontiff's domain akin to a courtly setting, and in imagining this anticipated religious assembly precisely opposite the residency, and by pictorially matching its scale, the artist presents the colonial and religious powers as two equal and competing domains of authority. The depicted procession of the Udaipur ruler and the British agent can thus be interpreted as proceeding towards the Jain Pontiff's assembly or towards the British residency. The artist may also be seen as directing the Jain Pontiff to imagine himself in a position of authority when he arrives in Udaipur. And in turn, the artist has imagined that this invitation letter would be effective, that its objective would be realized by the Pontiff's arrival. So the scroll is simultaneously a grand representation of an ideal city, a topographical map, a picture of overlapping and relational identities, and an invitation letter embedded in contemporaneous diplomatic correspondence. So while we can infer that the artist painted the scroll in the sequence that I have described thus far, it's important to consider that Jinnaharsha Suri, the recipient of the scroll, must have unrolled it to first see the Vignapti, the invitation letter. And I know this because you have his address printed on the other side, so you know how the scroll was initially rolled in and how it was unfurled. The attached letter employs poetic renditions in Sanskrit and regional dialects of Gujarati and Rajasthani to eulogize the invited monk. The letter ends with emphasizing that the Jain community of Udaipur, the city's residents, and the entire, the various communities from various, the Muslims, the court, these various neighborhoods are listed, how they are also eager to welcome the eminent pontiff, that this arrival would bring prosperity to the entire Mewar country, and that the day he would arrive would be like no other day. The verses will find echo in the artist's careful pictorial imagining of the presence of the arrived monk, the time that is yet to come. These gestures, in my view, imbue the scroll with multiple temporalities, suggesting that the charismatic landscape of Udaipur would become an even more ideal place after the invited Jain pontiff's domain was established. Interestingly, the scribes also offered an apology for the delay in sending the painted letter. Why? Seth Joravar Malji Bapna was away and Sher Singh Mehta, his secretary, was on an extended leave. The anxiety reflected in these transmission details suggests towards actually the strategic role of the Vignapti Patra. Already by 1818, the British colonial agent James Todd wrote about the lack of mercantile fervor in Udaipur. He had taken it upon himself to revive the city's mercantile activity by sending his own invitation letters to merchants. The years from 1823 onwards were particularly stressful for Udaipur rulers as they had to negotiate their own positions and financial needs with the British East India Company and the regional merchants. By October 14, 1830, Todd's successor, Agent Cobb, who is depicted here, ensured that Udaipur agency was abolished. The Udaipur ruler Jawan Singh immediately sent a letter to Cobb stating that he was very hurt by this treatment. It appears, therefore, that this Vignapti Patra was sent around the same time in 1830 with the diplomatic aim to prop up another sphere of authority in the city. The scroll, therefore, suggests that merchant collectives who commissioned such painted invitation letters not only effectively displayed their religious piety and inserted their towns into a pilgrimage economy, but also reinforced their political and economic authority in the wake of British colonization. The question is, did the monk come? Although my research thus far has not yielded any information whether Jinnaharsha Suri came or not the following year, that's the year of 1831, I have been able to establish that the neighborhood around the British residency was transformed into an important Jain neighborhood in 1832. The same merchant who played a key role in commissioning the invitation letter, Bapna, whose secretary was on extended leave, built a temple there, and his portrait was prominently painted on the entrance wall in the prevalent style of Udaipur court painting, referring to the portrait of Jawan Singh, the current ruler. A diverse and large community of monks, nuns, and lay people traveled together on these pilgrimages, And so there is this prospect that many of them got to see these kind of invitation letters. We know that they heard those kind of guzhals as well, with which I started. So that is precisely one reason that why these Vignapti Patras forged an important vernacular and popular domain in South Asia. There were several of these invitation letters that were circulated by various cities, right? And as we can see that these are very heterogeneous objects. They've been on the margins of art, and they've been on the margins of history, right? They've been on the margins of art that they lack a certain kind of quality. They are folk. They've been on the margins of history because the emphasis has always been given to the textual record and to the letters within them and not the paintings within them. But we can see that the choices that have been made here give as much an opportunity to the artist to think about idealizing the place as much as bringing in questions of the real politic into place. And we want to just take into account that as viewers, as audiences saw the scroll, how might they have perceived it? I think that the artist, by juxtaposing these two axes, really sets a certain kind of an interpretive process into action. Monks probably unrolled this very unwieldy 72 feet long scroll 2 to 3 foot at a time, exactly the kind of vignettes, the parts that you've been seeing. Each one of them has been around 2 feet. As they visually traversed through the city of Udaipur, they saw the courtly domains absolutely in the end, right, after they had seen this very vibrant other spaces. While they were seeing it, their seeing was always disrupted by the other axis of the procession, right? So you literally have those kind of disruptions taking place through various domains and through various strategies. And so this scroll really defied any notion of engaging with the whole picture. Rather, it constituted several pictures that stack up in the mind's eye as one unrolls it, almost replicating the act of traveling or walking through the city of Udaipur. It recalls a sense of being in the place. This bazaar image formulates a mapping practice that, in my opinion, is vernacular in nature, not only because of the translated images that we see in this scroll, but also because of this very sense of the street, the everyday, the plethora of spatial stories that one encounters in this object. Thank you.
That was terrific. Thank you. I'm just going to quickly switch this up. Claudia, you're going to have to start it. I don't know where you start a PowerPoint. Claudia Orenstein is Associate Professor of Theater at Hunter College and at CUNY, the CUNY Graduate Center. And she has a new book coming out in June called The Rutledge Companion to Puppetry and Material Performance. And her talk today is titled The Additional Complexities of Puppets and Performing Objects in Indian Performance Traditions. And it deals with a number of different modes and ways, et cetera, potentials of puppets and objects for storytelling within Indian performance traditions as they are reconfigured in the current shifting economic and social context. So, Claudia.
I first want to say that the book that's coming out is a co-edited volume. So I do want to mention my co-editors, John Bell and Dacia Posner. It's a collection of 28 essays from authors around the world on puppetry, and the term that Dacia Posner is offering to us, material performance, as a way of thinking of the materiality engaged in performance. So my research and interest in puppetry is broad scale, but I've been spending a lot of time in India and writing on Indian puppetry. and I just came back from a 2-month research trip in which I went to see a lot of places and forms that I had not seen before. So I wanted to, I've been hearing a lot about things, and I wanted to know, so what is really happening? Who's really performing? Are these being performed? As you hear a lot, that puppetry is a dying art in India, and is that the case? Forgive me if this presentation, I cast a very wide net, and it's not perhaps as in detail and as sorted through as I hope to have it with this material in the future, because I've just come back. I've also seen a lot and have a lot of background in the more contemporary puppetry that's being done, and some other traditions that are not included here. So this is mostly from what I've just been experiencing. Puppets and performing objects introduce both additional expressive potential as well as further dilemmas to performance contexts. If there exist vernaculars of text, of music, of actor, and of space, objects, puppets, scrolls, boxes bring their own visual and kinetic rhythms and vocabularies to performance situations. They triangulate performance, transforming the relationship between actor and spectator into one between actor, object, and spectator. They entail a montage aesthetic in treating viewers to tie together those aspects of story presented through visual imagery and three-dimensional constructions with those presented through speaking, singing, acting, or other means. Traditional forms also carry within their emblematic objects and images a realm of associations which can weigh into the reading and consideration of performance events even before they have begun. Puppets and performing objects present a tension between their presence as visual art objects and their deployment as performance elements. On display, as many now are in houses, craft exhibits, and museums, they may act like visual or sculptural artworks, but they inevitably evoke and call for the enactments required to complete them and to reveal their full natures and functions. But such performances are more difficult to preserve and perpetuate than the objects themselves. In today's shifting Indian economic and social worlds, puppets and performing objects are navigating a rocky terrain both inside and outside of performance. Their artists are sometimes capitalizing on, but also falling prey to the added complexities performing objects bring to creating and sustaining the arts. Notions of folk art, traditional art, classic art, and high art, as well as caste and class, intersect with these objects, how they are crafted, used, and handed down. And these designations are themselves shifting as puppetry and other forms seek out new social and economic equilibriums. The ubiquitous claim is that puppetry and related traditions are dying arts, but the full picture deserves further detailed attention as committed and passionate artists exist and struggle to create performance within and against the odds. Their reliance on crafted objects as essential tools of their trade adds to the complexity of their task. But equal to the difficulty of supporting performance is the job of shifting the discussion around Indian puppetry to speak not just of how it is dying, but of how it is living today and how artists are crafting its future. Bengali scroll storytelling, incorporating the visual art of the painted scroll within the performative art of storytelling, offers a pertinent example. In her 2002 article, From Oral Tradition to Folk Art, Reevaluating Bengali Scroll Paintings, Beatrix Hauser already traces the process of this tradition moving from being primarily a performance form to one in which performance falls away to benefit its aspect as painting, specifically a form of folk art. In the past, members of the Patyak community traveled house to house, scrolls slung in a bag on their shoulders, singing local folk and religious tales, while displaying and unraveling their painted images. In exchange, they received offerings of food, clothing, and money from the villagers. They were a beggar caste, mostly illiterate, although their lyric compositions bespoke of linguistic artistry. In consideration of the object in performance, it is important to note that a beggar with a scroll, a painting, images of the gods and beloved local folk heroes in hand, must be something more than a mere beggar. The scroll shifts the presence of the itinerant begging storyteller into something more. It is a calling card that distinguishes him from others who are simply asking for money. It attests to his artistic proficiency and knowledge of important stories. It allows people to invite him into their homes. A bag full of scrolls hints at the breadth of entertainments he has to offer, while still leaving their riches to be slowly discovered, unrolled, and savored. Today, Bengali scroll storytelling has been recast and elevated through attention to the scrolls primarily as paintings and their status as folk art. In the process, the scrolls, once equal partners in performance, have ventured out on their own into international art markets, with collectors and museums paying relatively lucrative sums for them, simultaneously diminishing the value of the performative aspect of the form. Most of the members of Naya Village, a Bengali scroll storytelling community in Midnapur, West Bengal, today spend their time painting all types of artworks, that is, smaller things they can sell, not just scrolls, for tourists and art and craft sales. Their subjects have also expanded to include the events of September 11th and the 2004 tsunami, which are favorites of foreign buyers. And I had at least 3 or 4 people sing me about George Bush and his fight against bin Laden, and you can see him up there on the right side of that scroll. Madha Chitrakar recounted how 2 foreigners at an Indian craft fair fought over the tsunami scroll he and his wife Hazra had painted. They collaborate on these scrolls. Finally, flipping a coin to see who'd get it, a very different state of affairs from the usual Indian bargaining routine. Indeed, Hazra has brought an invigorating and dynamic artistic style to their scrolls, moving away from the traditional linear model, where one image simply follows another. In her tsunami image, sweeping lines connect different parts of the scroll from top to bottom, uniting all events into a single sorrowful experience, making for a more visually captivating wall hanging. The scroll painters still compose and sing stories to accompany their scrolls, but they no longer perform these house to house. Instead, they perform for buyers at art fairs, for local village festivals, for university groups, and they are also commissioned by schools and community organizations for performances dealing educationally with social issues like AIDS and violence against women, which are now significant scroll subjects as well. And almost all of the puppeteers and performers that I've encountered are being asked to do these kinds of performances. And one of the women of the scroll painting community, Rani, actually we'll see her here, she really, in this community, when they were asked to do AIDS scrolls, they were not given scripts. They were allowed to come up with their own things, and she's actually very involved in a group that's committed to educating about AIDS, and she used one to tell a story of somebody she had heard talk about their own situation at one of these meetings where her husband had AIDS and died, and then she had gotten AIDS from him. So she used that. So she had a very intimate relationship with this story and really wanted to sing and paint this scroll. But a lot of the performers, puppeteers who are being asked to do these social issues, they like them, but they really also want to do their traditional stories and other kinds of things. But those are often supported by government and other organizations. Some artists like Rani and her daughter and granddaughter, and I have to say it was very moving to see the 3 generations of women. They came together and we asked them to sing a scroll that they felt close to, or the one they liked to perform the most. And this one was about the snake goddess. And it's a story that they enjoy because it shows there's a woman who saves her husband, and it's a powerful story about women's power. Some artists like Rani and her daughter and granddaughter are still committed to the performance aspect of the art, but there is no denying that the selling of art is now the more lucrative part of the tradition, allowing members of this community, no longer beggars, to build and furnish their colorfully painted houses. The performances that were once the heart of the tradition now take a back seat to the aspect that has been designated as folk art and consumed within the international high art market. Scroll storytelling reveals the very different cultural worlds of the visual and performing arts and how they are expressed within modern consumer culture. The balancing act of sustaining, and I wanted to show this picture here because a lot of the puppeteers that I met, or these scroll painters, but also puppeteers I met who lived out in village areas, lived in some of the most beautiful places I've ever been. The balancing act of sustaining traditional arts is complicated here by the interdisciplinary nature of the object-centered performing art. Scroll performances are empty without their painted scrolls, and as much as scroll paintings may transform to captivate visual art lovers, an important part of their appeal is their identity within a tradition of performance, which has shaped their unique aesthetic. I don't have much written about this right now, but I wanted to show you, this is another community we visited of hand puppeteers, also in West Bengal. These puppeteers all make their own personal puppets. They each have their own style. They compose their own stories, as well as doing traditional stories, Radha and Krishna as folk characters rather really than a godly perspective is an important part of this tradition. And they also have been asked to perform stories on these social issues. And they still really mainly perform in the villages, at these festivals, and at and also at schools. They have a very strong community. A lot of the puppeteers no longer in what I was told is that in the families that used to all be a part of this performance tradition, now there's maybe one person within the family who really values it, and the rest of the family feels that it's not something for making money, and so they don't have much value to it. But the people who love it are really passionate about it, and they have this community place at the school where they meet every night and rehearse and perform for each other and support each other as a group. In the last elections, not the current ones, there were some issues that came up when they were being asked to do performances for political parties, and it ended up being very bad for them. Some of the puppeteers were beaten up for what they had done. And they're staying away from those kinds of commissions now. The puppet on the corner here, this little thing in the down corner on the left there, it took me a while to figure out what they were showing me, because I thought this was the inside core of the puppet heads, but it's not. This is, they said, an older traditional model of kinds of puppets that come from the region that this grew out of. In Rajasthan as well, puppet and object, so sorry, I put that in there because of the geographical connection. But in Rajasthan, as well as in the scroll paintings, puppet and object performance is losing ground to the transformation of performing objects into handicrafts. The ability or lack of ability to craft objects, whether for sale or for original performance, is central in recasting the fortunes of craftsmen and performers alike. The Kathputli string puppets of Rajasthan have become emblematic of the state's local culture, hanging in every tourist shop and appearing on tourist advertisements and even on buses. Yet finding a traditional 3-hour or even the reduced 45-minute show on the local epic tale of Amar Singh is nearly impossible. Today, the norm is 10 to 15-minute shows at restaurants, hotels, or museums, displaying only the novelty acts that are also part of the tradition: the dancing woman, the snake charmer, the horseback rider, the half-man, half-woman puppet, and the magician who removes and juggles his own head. Kathputliwalas were also once itinerant performers, beggars, setting up their portable stages in villages for local audiences in exchange for offerings. Mangilal Bhatt from Jaipur, who tells me he is the #1 puppeteer in Rajasthan, never went to school, instead traveling from town to town and performing with his family. His mother was then also part of the show, singing and adding dialogue out front. The unofficial colony in Jaipur, where they now live, home to around 50 families of the Bhatt caste, has only been around for about 30 years, during which time it has grown into a small, somewhat squalid but vibrant little village of its own. And there's another, probably many of you have heard about another colony in Delhi, in the Shadipur area, that recently has been under contention because the land, now very valuable, has been sold out from under them. They have maybe 1,200 families there, and they've been around for about at least 50 years. Now settled in urban centers like Jaipur or Delhi, some Bhatts get a relatively steady income from regular performances at local hotels and restaurants. A settled location also means that Mangilal Bhatt's 4 children, you see one of them here, and we'll see Mangilal Bhatt in a second, 4 young children attend regular school, and not seeing themselves confined to the performance caste handed down to them, dream of promising careers in math and science. The women no longer take part in the shows, which may require returning home late at night, instead tending to the children in the domestic sphere. Or like Siona Anil Bhatt here, who also helps build puppets for sale, they work towards other futures. She's training to be a hairdresser and hopes one day to have her own salon. Where performance persists, manipulation of puppets is less cultivated than musical skills. Musicians accompany the puppet shows, but are also called on to perform at many other occasions, such as weddings. For Kathputli puppeteers, again, the sale value of objects has trumped or complicated the value of performance. Members of the colony engage in a relentless, hand-worked yet factory-style production of the puppet figures that are found at tourist stands throughout Rajasthan and elsewhere. The popularity of puppets and these artists' quick and adept carving skills provide them with a livelihood that capitalizes on their association with their traditional puppetry art. And I mean, I have to say, I was really quite impressed with, they can do these extremely quickly and very adeptly, you know, there's a lot of different, they've got the whole thing set out, the people who are doing the carving, then she does the painting and the sewing. But carving puppets was not always part of their craft. According to Nazir al-Jaidazboi, in his in-depth book on Kathputli, The World of Rajasthani Puppeteers, puppets used to be carved by professional carpenters from the town of Basi, and the bots learned their carving skills later by imitating them. The puppets regularly built by bots and sold to tourists do not display the same finesse as those used in performance. Mangilal Bhatt, you see him there, his performance puppets, perhaps carved by his grandfather or probably more likely by a Basi carver, are larger than the tourist puppets, made of stronger wood and beautifully painted with smooth surfaces. But most of these figures, Raj characters who form the cast for the Amar Singh story, remain largely unused, hanging along the back at performances, simply watching and attending to the novelty acts. The long epic tale, as I am told, no longer interests audiences, and I've told local audiences as well as tourists, who all prefer the novelty bits. So some of the most beautiful puppets have transitioned from their roles as performers to become mere stage decor. Yet Mangilal, for one, continues to value performance and has brought his own ingenuity to it. His claim to fame involves a dancer with real flames coming from her head and hands, as well as a horse rider wielding 8 flames from different parts, as he does his standard trick of flipping under the belly of the horse. Mangilal is anxious to show me his portfolio of performance photos and the program from the 6th Putul Yatra National Puppetry Festival in 2011 in Assam, where he and his father played alongside traditional puppeteers from throughout India. Like so many puppeteers I have met, what he desires most is opportunities to perform and display his skills. Up in Delhi, the even more renowned Kathputli performer Puran Bhatt has earned yet greater success in both his mastery and transformation of the tradition. His acclaimed show Dola Maru, based on a traditional Rajasthani folktale and ballad, opens up, I'm sorry I don't have pictures of that here, this is a picture from that, but it doesn't show the stage, opens up the Kathputli small enclosed stage space and spreads the performance across a full proscenium stage. It incorporates the popular novelty acts, but into a longer story following other main characters. Puran, an extremely talented and motivated artist, a brilliant manipulator and inventive craftsman, has been influenced by the international models of puppetry in Delhi and his own global travels. He creates new puppets and stories outside of the traditional form, as well as recrafting the tradition itself. And I don't know if you can see too well on the picture where you see Puran. In the back, he has this beautiful eagle that he had made where the eyes light up. It's a kind of on a rod, and the head turns. So it's nothing like the string puppets from the tradition, as well as, of course, these large heads. One show, Magical Fluent, tells the story of the Bhatt's own struggle to keep their art alive, using, as his website states, quote, traditional string, shadow, and rod puppets with modern body, head, and glove puppets in a unique way to create a satire on their dying art form. For the Bhatt community, the ability to craft new puppets can open up the possibility for creative work within and without the tradition, but only for artists with a passion for and interest in the performance itself, which does not necessarily come along with being born into a caste. I'm going to just talk through these a little bit. So I was expanding, I was really interested in seeing these are performances with objects. How do they use them? So I've heard a lot about this Pabuji Ke Fad scroll painting. The paintings are done by a different family. This is Kalyan Joshi. He's a scroll painter. It comes from a traditional family that does the scroll paintings. They also have always done other kinds of painting, and he really is a kind of fine artist. And he not only sells these smaller artworks, but he's developing his own style and interest in the art. But he still paints the scrolls that these performers take out into the desert. There's a lot to say about them. I'll just say some, briefly. They perform usually at night, lighting up different parts of the scroll with a lantern that the Bopi, the woman, carries. She does the singing as well as him, and they sing the stories. Also, some of the stories are told in a more prosaic form, and they also in between sing folk songs, and these can go on for several nights. And they really are still performing really out in the villages. There are not many of these performers left, and we asked him if he had a child who was going to perform, and he said in his own family, he didn't even start performing till later, and not all the children in the family ended up becoming performers. It was something that was kind of came to you as a sort of spiritual calling. And we asked, so are any of your children performing? He says, well, not yet. And we said, so, will the tradition continue? He said, when, God wants somebody to be called, they will. But I was really interested in thinking about performance with objects just to try and see how these are done and how they incorporate the object. But it really acts as a backdrop as much as anything for performance and for pointing out. The other tradition of Rajasthan that I was also interested in was these boxes, these kavad boxes, and it is extremely difficult to see one of these, how they are used in a performance, and to find even people who have ever seen them. It's the tradition, and the few people who still perform it really do travel house to house, not even in a village setting, but house to house in these communities very far into the desert. And there are all of these stories painted on the boxes that they can carry with them. They, at the bottom, there's a drawer that opens up so people put offerings. Traditionally, there's an association both with this and the scrolls with genealogy, telling of genealogies. But this man, Dwarka Prasad, is a carpenter, and the carpenters who make these live in the town of Basi, and they make tons of them for sale. They make also new scrolls on topics like the story of Jesus Christ, ones on the alphabet, things that they think people are interested in, some that are sort of contemporary kind of educational issues. They've kind of gotten a lucrative market selling at crafts fairs, and these two aspects of the tradition have very different possibilities and opportunities in the current sphere. I did finally see Nina Subranani, who's an artist and filmmaker from Mumbai, has a small film on the people who perform these stories and do the storytelling with the boxes, and it's only 15 minutes long. I finally got a copy of it, and the first 10 minutes is all about the carvers and the people who make the boxes, and I was watching saying, please show me something, and at the end you can see somebody way out in a desert. It's a very intimate, almost casual kind of performance. I really wanted to know if the performers act out, how do they interact with these objects? He also makes other objects for sale and puppets. So I have here a puppet that's made by the Kathputli performers and the one made by him. And obviously, since he's a carver, he has a lot more wood in his puppets all the way through the body. And this is his wife, Kamla Bai, who's a much more jovial, happy person than she wanted to present herself as in this picture. And she also does the painting of the boxes. So they're combining skills of painting and carving. Not far from all of these performers in Rajasthan is the Barefoot College at Talonia. While the Kathputli performers no longer bank on performing in villages, members of Talonia, Rajasthan's Barefoot College, just an hour from Jaipur, continue to find puppets to be useful in their village work. Started in 1972 as a place for uneducated villagers to learn and exchange skills in areas such as architecture, engineering, dentistry, and handicrafts, responding to their own local issues and needs, Talonia has been using puppetry as a communication tool since 1981. Their puppet shows may be short, only 10 or 15 minutes long, but they help bring villagers into a discussion on pressing local issues in order to find grassroots solutions. Their most recent creation, which you can see down at the bottom corner there, done in collaboration with a visiting puppeteer from the UK, is a solar-powered camel that lights up, introducing the necessity of rainwater collection, one of Talonia's current campaigns. Talonia is also extremely active now in teaching villagers who come from around the world the skills to bring solar energy to their communities. Ram Niwas Ji, coming from the Dalit caste in the middle, ran the puppetry wing for many years, and found at Tolonia and through puppetry a means of moving beyond the social and political and religious boundaries dictated to him by his caste status. Bilan Devi, the only woman to have joined the puppetry group, adds a woman's perspective long missing from their shows. While Tolonia has given her many skills that helped her support her 4 children when she was widowed at a young age, she values her current work in the puppetry wing because it allows her to say anything to anyone of any caste, gender, or status. The puppetry group also includes a Katputli caste member over there, and I'm sorry I don't have his name, who never did any puppetry before coming to Tolonia. If in Rajasthan and West Bengal the ability to craft objects for sale has helped in eroding the performance aspect of traditional forms, in Karnataka, beautifully carved wooden puppets have been the continued link in performance in a way that fleshes out questions of what counts as a performance tradition. This group of string wooden puppets from Halare, Karnataka, was given to the group, this company of performers. They say 250 years ago. My friend thinks it's probably more like 150. The story goes that the performers were so esteemed at a performance at court of Mysore that the Raj asked them what he could offer them, and they said they needed a new set of puppets. He then had the court craftsmen make these beautiful but very heavy specimens. They weigh about 3.7 kilograms each and require the strings attached to the headgear both to leave the puppeteer's hands free to manipulate the rods that move the puppet's hands and to help lift the weight of the puppet. Today, the youngest member of this company is 62. None of them know how to carve puppets, and they say that although they have scripts for 2 shows, they only really know 1, although they also use these puppets to do commission shows on social issues. If this looks like the end of the tradition, welcome to the world and the mind of Anupama Haskare. Well, the group in Halare certainly, Anupama, who has created Datu, a puppet company in Bangalore, and built and performed with around 800 puppets, has not been officially granted permission to bear the moniker traditional puppeteer. With a graduate degree in engineering from time spent in the US, Anupama returned to her Indian hometown with her children and wanted to educate them about traditional values in Bangalore's rapidly changing IT-inundated environment. She ended up studying puppetry with Ranganatha Rao, who is called a traditional puppeteer, and she has spent the past 8 years carving hundreds of puppets, painting them, making their clothes, writing the music and the stories for her shows, and performing. She bases her shows on the epics and other traditional source tales, and trained in Bharatanatyam dance, she has added legs to the puppets so she can make them dance. She is committed to using the Natya Shastra as a resource for developing the aesthetic of the puppet. And this has become a kind of problematic issue. She also creates annual puppet and doll festivals at her home. But her teacher, Rao, this is a picture of him in the corner there, Ranganatha Rao, says she is not my student, perhaps because of the changes she has made to the form or other things. Our friend, her friend, Dr. R. Ganesh, who's a Sanskrit scholar, offers to call her a classic rather than traditional or folk puppeteer, because of her interest in adhering to the Natya Shastra's aesthetic ideas. For him, he says, tradition is I do what I saw, I do what I heard, I do what I experienced. And classic is when you have a commitment to a particular aesthetic ideal here in the Natya Shastra. How did Ranganatha Rao become a traditional puppeteer? His grandfather, just to mix up the idea of traditional, his grandfather saw puppet performance in Mysore and enjoyed it so much he decided to go home and make himself a set of puppets and create a show, and he became a performer. The grandfather's son, Rao's father, never performed. Rao himself saw his grandfather, who died when Rao was 5, perform once when he was 3. Ownership of the puppets became an issue of contention in the family, but no other members of the family performed until Rao, who had become a teacher, was in his 40s and heard Kamala Chattopadhyaya give a lecture in which she said there were no surviving traditional rod puppets in Karnataka. She then encouraged him to revive the tradition, at which point he researched the work of his grandfather by talking with relatives and looking at the puppets and other materials, and taught himself to carve and perform. And these are puppets he carved. I mean, I have to say, someone who learned how to carve when he was 40, these are extraordinarily beautiful. Underneath here is one of the people he does acknowledge as his students, Datta, who also I think he does do some carving. He has created a whole idea about these puppets where he has an old interpretation, a mystical interpretation, a religious interpretation about the round thing that they wear on their heads. He says the puppets have their hands like this because they are forming mudras. He has a whole sort of thing that both Rao and my friend Anupama and these other puppeteers say has nothing to do with the tradition. He's just making it up. But he has this whole mystical view. So these are some of they call them, they have a lot strings to them, but they call these rod puppets because there's also a string tradition of Yakshagana-style puppets, which I don't have here in Karnataka. Just to round up here of some of the things I've seen, these are shadow puppeteers in Andhra Pradesh. Now, the grandparents you'll see there at the bottom, the gray-haired woman she's an award-winning singer, has been honored by Sangeet Natak Academy and other places, and she and her generation performed these puppets. The younger generation, or her children, Hanumanta here and his older brother Chandra, and you see him up with the Ganesha puppet there, became adept carvers because they make, like this in the middle, lots and lots of puppets to sell. And they never really became performers, learning how to sing and manipulate the puppets. They do a little now, but they put all their energy into selling these puppets. When we were there, they had just built a beautiful home, and they also had been given money by the government for this new space that they built a couple of years ago just for performance. And they have a kind of community of shadow puppeteers around the area who can all use this space. It's been around for 2 years. They've only had 2 shows in it so far. They don't really know how to use it or what to do with it. But they have started now to teach their children, to get the grandparents to teach their children the performances. So they are going kind of balancing this making puppets for sale with getting back to performance and committing to it by building this space by trying to teach the grandchildren. Okay. This is my last slide. These are string puppeteers of Assam. There are only 4 traditional puppeteers in Assam, in spite of having, Banikanta Burman, he's a 3rd-generation puppeteer, but the others all started their work in the 1970s, and all of the puppeteers are drawing on traditions from West Bengal. And Mushumi Bhattacharjee, who studies these forms, says these are traditional puppeteers because otherwise Assam would have no traditional puppeteers. They have a refreshing situation in that they all make their own puppets, but only for their own performances, not for sale. They continue to perform at local venues around Assam, pretty much dividing up the region among them. Also called on to for sponsored and social issues. Abhinokanta Sharman is unusual in many traditional puppeteers in that he crafts new shows, not on educational stories. For instance, shows based on Bollywood movies or on the story of Pulan Devi, the so-called bandit queen turned politician. Most were not part of traditional performance families, but pursued their own passions. Abhinokanta Sharman saw puppets from West Bengal perform in the 1970s and then went to West Bengal to study what they were doing. He created the first Bihu puppet. Bihu is a folk art in Assam, and people in Assam went wild for it, so he's kind of transformed the tradition. And Narayan Deka was an actor and then got into puppetry afterwards. So I won't read my conclusions since we've kind of come to the end of our time, but I'll just say that I hope this sort of opens up some of the issues that have to do with the way in which these objects and their different kind of trajectories in relationship to performance complicate issues about caste, about tradition, about sustaining performance, about what's high art, low art, etc. Thank you.
We've run out of time, and so I want to thank the 3 panelists. They were 3 really fabulous papers. Thank you. Really fantastic. And I'm sure that your head is buzzing with all sorts of questions and connections that you've been making between all 3. I'd like to invite you into what is the name of that room? And the Salzburger room, and we can all just continue the conversation there. But thank you so much.